Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today I'm joined by Tony Keller to discuss Canada's immigration system. Mr. Keller is a columnist with the Globe and Mail and the author of a new book called Borderline Chaos: How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong. The book, which won this year's Donner Prize for the best public policy book in Canada, examines how Canada's immigration system lost public confidence and what it will take to rebuild it. The thesis of the book is welcome immigrants, many, but not too many, mostly educated and skilled, always legal. The book explains that Canada is an unusual country and an outlier on immigration. For many decades, we took in more immigrants than any other developed country with very little public opposition. But in a few short years, it all came undone. How did Canada lose the political consensus that immigration is a good thing? What happened to our system and why? And what can we do to restore it? These are the questions that Borderline Chaos considers. Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. This book came at such an interesting time because, for years in my life, immigration was considered this wonderful thing. And Canada was a country that, we see ourselves as Canadians as a country of immigrants, a country that welcomes immigrants and supports immigration. And it just feels like in the last maybe 5 years or maybe a little more, we've taken a dramatic turn. Maybe you could explain why this is such a hot topic right now and what has changed.
Yeah, so Canada was, as you said, Canada was a bit of an outlier where our immigration rate through the Mulroney years, the Chrétien years, the Harper years, our immigration rate was actually pretty high. But Canadian immigration was always people chosen by Canada. Even refugees were overwhelmingly chosen from overseas. People applied, they used the point system, which we can maybe talk about a bit later. And Canada was choosing people mostly as economic immigrants. And there was a bit of a focus, which increased over time, on highly educated and highly skilled immigrants. And I think that helped to build a consensus among Canadians that immigration was good for Canada. Immigration was not something being imposed on Canada. It was something Canadians had chosen. It was something Canadians felt that they benefited from. It was something that Canadians felt was sort of controlled, managed, legal. It all added up to generally a positive public view and a kind of cross party consensus. It wasn't like liberals and conservatives had completely different immigration policies. There really wasn't that much daylight between the Chrétien policy and the Harper policy on immigration. So that was the positive situation we had before, and a lot changed once Trudeau came into government about underlying factors and about the way immigration was talked about and about the way immigration was practiced. And that, I think, has contributed to a really big change in attitude. So underlying factors about how immigration was being run ultimately changed how Canadians thought about the immigration system.
Let's talk a bit about that thesis. So the thesis is many but not too many. Has that changed? The other part is educated and skilled, mostly educated and skilled. Has that changed? And the other part of the thesis is always legal. And has that changed? I think the sense among a lot of Canadians, if you were to poll them, is that all three are gone now.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Definitely the first two, and the third is complicated. But the focus on highly skilled immigrants was really watered down, and the business community pressured the government to focus on essentially low skilled, low wage people, and a huge influx of people through the temporary immigration system. But all those temporary people want to become permanent. So it's not like it's really temporary. Um, and the control of numbers completely disappeared. We went from a very stable immigration system numbers all the way through the Chrétien years and the Harper years, basically no change in immigration, to an enormous spike late in the Trudeau government through the temporary systems. And legal, well, all these people coming to Canada really did come in legally, but they also came in through a system that Canadians did not know existed, had never heard anything about. The government never talked about temporary immigration in the way it talked about annual immigration numbers. And so we had a situation by 2022, 2023, 2024, where the number of people coming in under quote unquote temporary visas was so much larger than the traditional permanent immigration system. And the immigration minister and the prime minister never talked about that.
Yeah, it's not like it was an election issue that any party really voted, said this is our platform, and people voted for. We've got to go to break now, but we'll continue this conversation when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're joined by Tony Keller, who wrote a book called Borderline Chaos, which explores Canada's immigration system, what our country got right for a long time, and what has changed in recent years. So, Tony, one of the things that your book talks about is how Canada's immigration system differs from a lot of other developed countries. We were very much an outlier. And one of the things that made Canada an outlier is this famous points system that we have for immigration. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the history of the point system, you got to go back a little bit to understand it. But until the early 1960s, Canada had a fairly explicit racist immigration policy. I mean, our immigration policy was we really only want Europeans to come to Canada, Americans and British people ideally. And then we said, okay, that's crazy. The world doesn't work that way anymore. We can't run it this way. But we're not going to have unlimited immigration. So how are we going to decide who gets in and who doesn't get in? And a guy named Tom Kent, who at the time was the Deputy Minister of Immigration, he was a Brit, he himself was an immigrant, said, okay, let's come up with a system where we try to focus on, as he said, not people with strong backs and a venturesome spirit to work low wage, low end jobs and to work on farms, because that's not the world anymore. Let's focus on skilled people, educated people. Let's think about people who have education and skills that will allow them to get ahead in the Canadian economy. And over time, that system of giving people points for various, what economists would call human resource attributes, that system was evolved and evolved and evolved. And so Canada still had a system for choosing refugees, which was a small part of their immigration system. And we still had a system for family reunification, which is people get to bring in parents and grandparents. But also those numbers were limited. The big core of the system was economic immigrants, and there was a focus on high end. And just to show how different that was from the United States, the US also changed its immigration system starting in the 1960s to say no more racial quotas, no more national quotas. But they moved to a system that was overwhelmingly focused on family reunification, not on skilled immigrants. So Americans of both right and left would often look at Canada and say, that Canadian immigration system seems like a better idea. Why aren't we doing that?
Yeah, I actually noted in your book at one point you quote Donald Trump expressing admiration for Canada's point system. Uh, so
Absolutely.
so what changed? I mean, did we get rid of the system or did we just supplement it with all of these other programs?
We bypassed it. And by the way, the Donald Trump stuff was first term when Donald Trump was still a more conventional Republican and had conventional Republicans advising him. And those people said, look, the Canadian system seems like a really good idea. We would focus the immigration system on skilled people. What Canada did, it started in the Harper government, which then tried to pull it back, and then it really accelerated under the Trudeau government, was to build kind of a whole separate immigration system of temporary immigration feeding into permanent immigration. Now, and that temporary immigration, because of lobbying from the business community, also because of lobbying from provinces, also because of lobbying from the higher education sector, that temporary immigration system was and is very focused on lower wage labor to do non-temporary jobs, permanent jobs. Like if you're hiring somebody at a fast food restaurant, that's not a temporary job. It's a low wage job, it's a low skill job, and it's not temporary. So we kind of created this whole secondary system, and it grew again by 2022, 2023, 2024. It was much bigger than the permanent immigration system, and it was entirely composed of people who wanted to become permanent immigrants. So two-step immigration, not necessarily a bad idea, but the focus became low skill, not high skill, and
Now,
that completely diluted the point system.
one of the things that the Trudeau government emphasized with the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program is they tied it very much to the pandemic. Do you think it actually was related to the pandemic? And why did it continue after the pandemic ended? Or did it actually start before that?
Yeah, so it had started under the Harper government. The numbers of people coming in at temporary had increased greatly. And then the Harper government, late in its term, realized, you know what, this isn't a good idea, and started to scale it back. And the Trudeau government ramped it back up, and then absolutely ramped it up during the pandemic. And that was lobbying. Provinces were lobbying, saying, let us let in far more students. Businesses were lobbying, saying, we need more workers. There was the whole idea that there's a shortage of workers, which is not a real thing, and that the shortage was primarily about low wage, low skill workers. It's kind of remarkable we did this, but this is in fact what we did.
Yes, it's an incredible book because it really puts the statistics and the facts to something that a lot of Canadians feel, intuitively, but it really provides the evidence of what's going on. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're joined by Tony Keller, the author of a book called Borderline Chaos. The title, I love it, Tony, because it took me a minute. I have to admit, I realized only after I'd started the book that borderline chaos means chaos in the borderline, and that it's about immigration. I just thought it was it initially. I just thought it meant, we're almost at the edge of chaos, but no, you're saying something a little bit of play on words there. Now, one of the examples in the book that really stood out to me was not just about the changes in temporary immigration. It was changes to foreign student immigration. And you gave an example that I thought was truly shocking. It was the number of students at, I would say, low quality, low tier Canadian colleges claiming refugee status. And when you compared it to, for example, international students at University of Toronto, essentially none were claiming refugee status, but you had hundreds at some of these low quality colleges claiming refugee status. Maybe you could expand on that and maybe give some other examples of what was happening with the student stream.
Yeah, so the student stream became the main temporary immigration stream, and the stream actually also became the main low-wage work stream. So somebody going to the University of Waterloo or the University of Toronto or the University of Alberta as a foreign student is not going to become a low-wage temporary foreign worker. They're actually a student. They're actually someone Canada wants to attract, and we may want to attract them to remain after they've done their student program and become immigrants. Highly skilled, highly educated, likely to have high-paying jobs. Great. And they have options. They can go somewhere else. A foreign student going to the University of Waterloo studying engineering, they have other job opportunities in the rest of the world. They're willing to take those skills back to their home country. We actually have to fight to attract them. But a big part of the student program, and in fact, the majority of the student program, became students going to very short programs at not particularly good schools, many of which were in Ontario and were public-private partnerships that were encouraged by the Ford government. So this was a federal, provincial, joint problem that was created here. So
and
if you're
created by
coming to
industry
Canada,
as well. Created by industry as well.
absolutely. Oh yeah, no, this was a cooperation among business, provinces, and the federal government. Like interests were all aligned. It's just it didn't line up to the national interest. So if you're coming to Canada to go to a short program at a low-end college, that's kind of possibly a complete bird course program that only lasts a matter of months, but you've been told if you pay $10,000 college tuition, Conestoga College, you're going to get to have Canadian permanent residency, which means you're going to become a citizen. You're going to be able to bring in your family. That's it. Your whole life is going to be changed. And that is essentially what recruiters were pitching overseas in a number of different countries with a real focus on Indian students. That's a pretty good deal. I would pay $10,000 to become a Canadian citizen and have all of my descendants be Canadian citizens.
If I recall correctly, the government was also making commitments that there was a path to citizenship for these students, and they now seem to have really shifted what they're saying.
Yeah, so the pitch to students was, listen, if you come to Canada, you take this short course, you work at Tim Hortons, you then get a continuation to continue working at Tim Hortons after you graduate, you're going to get permanent residency. And the problem, aside from the fact that this was not ideal for Canada, was that the numbers became so large that the number of permanent residency spaces is absolutely dwarfed by the number of people we let in under the student program. So if you were a student who was anticipating, I'm going to get Canadian citizenship, I'm going to scrounge up all my family's money and commit it to this bird course at this college somewhere in southwestern Ontario, and then you realized after a few years, I'm not getting permanent residency, you'd say, I think I should apply for asylum because that may be your last opportunity to stay in Canada. And Canada has a very liberal asylum policy. Um, People get rejected, but the vast majority of people who apply actually are found to be refugees. So that became a vehicle. And yes, the numbers went up to, I think in 2024, there were about 20,000 students who made refugee applications, which is up from essentially zero in prior years.
Yeah, I mean, it also, even if your claim is ultimately unsuccessful, which it might succeed, but even if it's unsuccessful, you delay, and remain in the country.
That's right.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're joined by author Tony Keller to talk about his book about Canadian immigration. Now, Tony, public opinion on immigration, as we've discussed, it has shifted dramatically over the last few years. Do you worry that if the government doesn't fix the problem that they've created by, through all of these rapid changes to our system, do you think if they don't fix it, that our traditionally positive view of immigration in this country will be permanently damaged?
Yeah, I think exactly that. It's a major concern for me. And I also don't want to see immigration become a political wedge issue, because that's what it's become in the United States. In the United States, I think both the Republican Party and the Democrats have essentially gone crazy on immigration. And you have a Republican Party that shifted further right. You have a Democratic Party that shifted further left. Had a Republican Party that came to see immigration itself as a problem, and you have a Democratic Party that came to see any sort of control over immigration as a problem. And neither of those positions make any sense. Canada had this consensus where both conservatives and liberals said, yeah, immigration is positive, but obviously there have to be limits, there have to be controls, there have to be measures put in place to get the maximum benefit out of immigration. And it won't be unlimited, but it can be quite generous and actually at a much higher level than the United States. So my worry is we end up more like the United States on immigration, which would not be good.
Some people hear criticism of Canada's immigration system. We're having a conversation today about the problems with the system. And they might hear this and assume that the position of your book is anti-immigration. And that is not your argument at all, is it?
That's right. No, the one of the things that I've been extremely pleased about with the book in the talks that I've given is realizing that the people who like my book are not only from one political party. The people who have come up to me and told me they agree with me, they like my book, they agree with what I'm putting forward, conservatives, liberals, and even New Democrats. I remember having a conversation in Calgary at my book launch in that city, and somebody came up to me and she told me how much she loved the book. She had read the excerpt in the Globe and Mail. She thought it was bang on. And I said to her, just briefly after conversation, looking at her, I said, "You're an NDP voter in Alberta, aren't you?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why do you like my book?" And she said, "Why would I not? It's common sense. This is not an anti-immigration book. This is a get immigration right for the benefit of Canada and immigrants. Why would anybody be against that?" So that's the consensus I want to get back, where conservatives, liberals, and New Democrats can argue about all kinds of things, but maybe we can have common ground on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really actually quite important to acknowledge real concerns with public policy where it's gone wrong. And if you ignore legitimate concerns and problems that are really in your face, if you pretend those don't exist, it actually creates a space for more extreme voices.
Absolutely. I think that is exactly right. So when I started writing about this, before I'd written the book, I started really writing about this in 2022, 2023. And at some point in 2023 into 2024, I wrote a column where I said, the liberals have to fix this. we do not want a situation where the liberals turn immigration into a wedge issue, which I feared they were going to do, and which conservatives always feared they would do, where they would say, we dare you conservatives to criticize our policy so we can accuse you of being racist. And that was my nightmare scenario. And in truth, what the government is doing now in trying to rein in the immigration system, there are many more things they need to do. There are many things they could do better. There are many things they could do faster. But they have used the language of, we must get the immigration system back under control. We must improve the immigration system. They've basically made it their business to try to fix the immigration system, or at least say they're doing it, as opposed to trying to run on daring conservatives to attack them.
Yeah. Are you optimistic about the changes that the Carney government is implementing? Do you think that they're going to be able to fix the system? You do end the book with policy recommendations.
I range from mildly optimistic to concerned, but they seem to be following, at least rhetorically, many of my recommendations at the back of the book. And I have been told by liberals that it feels like the Carney government took my book, photocopied my recommendations at the end, and is trying to pursue those.
I mean, that must feel great. And congratulations, Tony, on winning the Donner Prize. That must have been amazing. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Christine.
We've heard today about Canada's immigration system and how it changed and why public confidence has shifted so dramatically. How should Canada balance welcoming newcomers with maintaining a system that Canadians trust? You be the judge. Thanks for watching Canadian Justice, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.